Sherlock Holmes and the Pursuit of the Demon in the Dark. Chapter 1, The Midnight Scream. There are sounds that are heard only once in a lifetime, yet they haunt the human soul forever. A howling wind swept across the desolate moors near Dartmoor forest, carrying with it a chilling, bone-deep cold. The sky was grey and oppressive, the crescent moon hidden behind dark clouds, leaving behind only faint, shifting patches of light like wandering souls. The ancient forest whispered with rustling leaves, but within the wind, another sound could be heard, a scream. It was neither human nor animal. It was a sound that pierced straight through to the marrow, dragging nightmares out from the depths of the subconscious. The scream rang out at the stroke of midnight, and then everything fell silent again, as if nothing had happened. No one in the village dared to step outside. Doors were bolted shut, curtains drawn. They referred to that place only in hushed whispers. A land once cursed, where demons had once walked. The next morning, the body of a man was discovered at the forest's edge. There were no major wounds. But his face was unforgettable, eyes bulging so wide it seemed they might pop from their sockets, mouth agape in a twisted grimace, skin wrinkled and bluish as if choked by an unimaginable terror. On his chest, a handprint was still clearly visible, not one belonging to a living man, but something larger, longer, and colder. The local inspector shook his head wordlessly. No one understood what had happened. The police reluctantly recorded, death by cardiac arrest due to extreme fright. But the villagers whispered another truth, it has returned. That which they dared not name, dared not look at, dared not dream of. They called it only the shadow. In London, within the cozy confines of 221B Baker Street, Sherlock Holmes was lighting his pipe with an air of complete nonchalance. Snow was falling outside the window, the distant sound of horses' hooves echoed faintly. But something cut through the tranquil atmosphere, a black envelope, with no return address, no seal. Only his name written in dry, reddish-brown ink, Holmes. He opened the letter. Inside, a single handwritten line in fading ink. The demon has returned. Holmes read it in silence. His eyes narrowed, a shadow passed across them before they lit up, as if he had just touched something fascinating. He set the letter down, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled out an old file bound with frayed twine. Without looking at me, he spoke. Watson, do you remember the case 5 years ago near Dartmoor? The strange deaths of 3 men on 3 consecutive nights, no wounds, no witnesses, no clues. All died of fright, wearing the same death-stricken expression. I told you then that something hadn't ended. Now, it has just begun again. Holmes turned to me, his eyes gleaming with thoughtful excitement. He grabbed his fedora, donned his long overcoat, and looked as calm as if he were heading out for a Sunday stroll. Let's go, Watson. The darkness is waiting. The journey from London to Devonshire took over a day. By the time we reached the outskirts of Dartmoor, dusk had already fallen. A cold dampness seeped from the leafless old trees, heavy with the smell of moss and decaying earth. The air carried a musty scent, like a corpse hastily buried. We stopped at Grimstone Village, a tiny hamlet with just over 30 rooftops. The people here lived mainly by farming and hunting. Everyone seemed on edge, eyes haunted, as if recently touched by unspeakable horror. The deceased was identified as Henry Calloway, a renowned hunter in the region. He had lived alone in a wooden cabin near the forest, about 500 meters from the village. They found him the morning after that strange scream was heard. Holmes went straight to the scene. The cabin was small, rustic, filled with the marks of a solitary man's life. A plate of venison still sat unfinished on the table. The window was wide open, but there were no signs of forced entry. What caught Holmes's attention, however, were the footprints. Outside the porch, leading into the forest, was a trail of large tracks, very large, as if left by some massive creature. But curiously, there were only tracks going forward, none returning. Holmes crouched down, examined them closely, then touched the imprint with his hand. Soft. Fresh. But not human. And not from any known animal in Britain. Watson, do you notice anything? These tracks have no claw marks. They're shaped like a hand, but with only 3 fingers. A shiver ran down my spine. Childhood tales of monsters came rushing back unbidden to my mind. We returned to the village after nightfall. Just then, the local postman hurried over with another note. No one knew who had slipped it into his pocket. When he checked, it was simply there. The paper was yellowed with age, the handwriting crude. Stop investigating. Some things that live in the dark do not wish to be seen. Holmes showed no sign of fear. He burned the note in the fireplace, watching the flames dance silently. Then he said, "Watson, do not sleep tonight. We're going into the forest." We left the village at midnight. The moon was shrouded by clouds, the light barely enough to make out the path. Holmes moved slowly, silently. I followed behind, feeling the darkness tightening around us with each step. As we neared the spot where Henry Calloway had died, Holmes suddenly stopped and signaled for silence. I strained my eyes. In the darkness, at the edge of the forest, something was moving. A large shadow, taller than any man, stood perfectly still. I felt the blood drain from my face. Holmes remained unmoving. The shadow seemed to stare at us, though I could not see its eyes. A numbing cold crept down my spine, as if pierced by something other than the wind. Suddenly, the shadow moved. It didn't run. It didn't glide. It simply melted into the darkness, vanishing within seconds. Holmes stepped to where it had stood. No footprints. No trace. But the grass was flattened, and soaked with a thick, black liquid. He collected a small sample into a vial. We returned to the inn around 3 in the morning. Before going to bed, Holmes placed a hand on my shoulder. "Watson, I do not believe in demons. But I do believe someone wants others to believe in them. And that is more dangerous than a real demon." The next morning, Holmes rose early and visited the local morgue. He examined Henry's body thoroughly. When he emerged, he told me, "There's a small puncture wound on the victim's neck, very tiny, like a needle prick. I suspect he was injected with a powerful hallucinogen, enough to trigger extreme panic. But it would have to be an incredibly rare compound, almost non-existent in Europe." I asked, "Then who did it? And why?" Holmes replied, "I don't know yet. But I am certain of one thing, this won't be the last scream we hear in the night." He took the first letter again, flipped it over. There, barely visible to the naked eye, was a tiny dot, but under a magnifying lens, I could see it clearly, a symbol shaped like a hand with 3 splayed fingers. Holmes smiled faintly. "We've stepped into someone's game. And he wants us to play. Watson, the hunt has begun. And I believe this time, the thing we're chasing, is chasing us." Chapter 2, Footprints in the Darkness. Not all footprints belong to living creatures, some are left behind solely to sow fear and lead people to their deaths. That morning, a thick fog blanketed the ground like an enormous funeral shroud. The sunlight could barely pierce a few yards ahead, casting everything in an eerie, ghostly glow. Beneath the chill of the mist, the wooden cabin where Hunter Henry Calloway had died looked like an old, forgotten box left to rot in the forest. Holmes stepped over the threshold, his eyes silently sweeping the land ahead like an eagle scanning for prey. I followed close behind, stepping as lightly as I could. Dry twigs cracked sharply beneath my feet like the slash of a knife. The image of Henry's twisted, terrified face still lingered in my mind. And yet, it was precisely that horror which made me realize Holmes was now at his most focused. For a case with no murder weapon, no witnesses, and no logic to cling to, that was what truly fascinated him. Just outside the cabin, a narrow trail led directly into the forest. The drooping branches of ancient trees hung like broken limbs, poised to snatch any foolish soul who dared venture in. But what stopped us in our tracks were the footprints pressed into the damp earth. I could hardly believe my eyes. The prints were grotesquely large. 1.5 times the length of a human foot, and so wide I could have fit both my hands within a single one. Each step was nearly a meter apart, evenly spaced, and deeply sunken. But that wasn't the strangest part. The shape was unlike anything I'd ever seen, not human, not animal. There were no claw marks, no distinct toes, just distorted ovals with jagged, molten-looking edges, as if something had been melted down and pressed into the earth. Holmes crouched low, letting his fingers lightly skim the rim of a print. The soil was still wet, meaning the tracks had been made just last night. He pulled a metal ruler from his pocket and silently jotted down measurements. We followed the trail. It led north, straight into the forbidden woods the villagers called the Forest of the Devil. I suddenly remembered last night. That shadow. The one that left no footprints, made no sound, yet made your body feel strangled just by being near it. A presence that defied naming. Holmes stopped where the trail vanished. Ahead lay a patch of forest black as ink, not from the absence of light, but from trees so densely packed no ray of sun could slip through. The air grew colder. Even the wind held its breath, as though afraid to disturb something sleeping deep within the forest's heart. I whispered, "Are you sure we should go in?" Holmes didn't answer immediately. He stared into the woods for a long moment, then turned to me. "If we turn back now, it ends here. We leave Grimstone behind, and let the strange deaths continue in silence. But if we go in, Watson, there's no turning back." I nodded. Together, we stepped into the darkness. Inside the forest, it felt like another world entirely. The smell of rotting wood, dead leaves, and damp moss mixed into a heavy, suffocating, ancient scent. Each step we took broke twigs beneath our feet, rustled dry leaves, but even those sounds seemed to be swallowed, never echoing. As if the forest were devouring all noise. Holmes led the way. He didn't need a torch, only a rough map of the area borrowed from the forest warden. The strange footprints still appeared now and then. Sometimes clear, sometimes faint, as though the creature was moving in and out of reality. Suddenly, Holmes stopped and raised his hand in signal. I froze. In front of us, between two massive trees, sat a moss-covered stone, and on its surface was something that made my blood run cold, a long smear of blood. But it wasn't red. It was black, thick as tar. Holmes used a small knife to scrape a sample into a vial. Then he turned to me. "This isn't human blood. It doesn't dissolve in water, has no smell, and it's so viscous it can't flow naturally. I've seen this substance before, but I can't recall where." We pressed on for another 20 minutes and reached a small clearing, an area without trees, just bare earth and scattered stones. At the center was a strange ring of rocks. They weren't evenly spaced, yet somehow formed a spiral. Like an ancient symbol of some kind. Holmes stepped close to the ring. He said nothing. He simply touched one of the stones on the edge, and immediately withdrew his hand. The surface was ice-cold, like frost in the height of summer. "Watson, this is no ordinary place. It was made for a purpose, perhaps a ritual, perhaps a seal. And I fear, someone is trying to awaken something long buried." I stepped back. A strange wind began to rise, carrying with it a sound that chilled my spine. It wasn't the wind whispering through trees. It was more like a moan. We retreated. On the way back, Holmes stopped one last time at the edge of the forest. He picked up a small scrap of skin near the base of a tree. Thin, leathery, charred brown, and it smelled of burnt flesh. He looked at me, voice low. "There's something living in that forest. Not a human. Not a beast. But what's more terrifying, is that someone is keeping it alive." By the time we returned to Grimstone, the afternoon sun was sinking. The villagers had gathered in clumps outside the tavern. When they saw us, they fell silent. An old man stepped forward, leaning on a cane, his eyes sunken like dry wells. "You went into the forest of the devil. It's a miracle you're still alive." Holmes ignored the comment and asked directly, "Have you ever seen footprints that large before?" The old man shook his head. "No. But my grandfather once told me, 50 years ago, there was a strange killing in the forest. The victim was a priest. Before he died, he said he heard whispering voices at night, coming from among the stones. Then he walked into the woods, and never came out. All they found was his clothing, and those strange footprints leading deeper into the dark." Holmes was silent. I saw something flicker across his face, part fear, part excitement. He turned to me. "Watson, we're not dealing with an ordinary murderer. This is a complex game, and the other side has been preparing for a very long time." That night, Holmes sat at the table for hours, analyzing the black blood, the charred skin, and the icy stone markings. He didn't speak, didn't eat, only wrote and sketched. Just before dawn, he finally set his pen down and closed the file. "Watson, I need you to do two things in the morning. First, go to the old priest's house, where the murder 50 years ago took place, and search for any remaining books or records. Second, ask the villagers about ancient rituals, especially any involving stones or circles." I asked, "And what about you?" Holmes replied, "I'm going back into the forest. Alone." I started to object, but he was already up, donning his cloak and stepping out the door. His silhouette dissolved into the morning mist, vanishing like the very creature we were chasing. And I remained behind. The fire in the hearth began to die. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks. And I knew. From now on, we weren't the ones hunting the demon. The demon was following our every step. Chapter 3, The Man Without a Shadow. Fear does not arise from death, but from what we cannot explain with reason. The next morning, I returned to the wooden house where we were staying in the village of Grimstone. Holmes had left before dawn, leaving behind dozens of notes and strange sketches on the table, among them a circle of stones marked with symbols unlike any language I had ever seen. I examined the sample of black blood and the charred piece of skin again, but without Holmes's insight, they led only to a dead end. So I prepared to carry out his instructions, to search for traces of the case from 50 years ago. I arrived at the old parsonage. It had long been abandoned, the rotting door swinging open with just a light push. Inside, everything was coated in dust and cobwebs, with the furniture decaying in place. But in the last room, beneath a pile of ruined books, I found a leather-bound notebook. The pages were yellowed, the handwriting shaky. The final line read, "He walks in the moonlight and casts no shadow. I do not know who he is, but he does not belong to this world." A chill ran down my spine. I brought the notebook back with me, haunted by a nameless unease. Just as I returned, a village boy came running, out of breath. His face was pale, and he said his father had seen something strange the night before. I followed him at once to a house on the edge of the village, where the moonlight had blanketed the nearby fields all night. The man sat curled up in a corner of the room, his eyes vacant. When I questioned him, he said only one sentence. "I saw him. He walked in the moonlight. But he had no shadow." The room fell into a deathly silence. Even the wind seemed to stop. I stared at him and asked again, "Are you certain? No shadow, though the ground was brightly lit by the moon?" He nodded, his voice trembling. "I've walked at night my whole life. I know how moonlight casts shadows. But him, tall, broad-shouldered, walking like he floated above the ground. There was nothing beneath him. As if the moonlight avoided him. I left the house uneasy. What could cause a man's shadow to vanish in the light? Hallucination? Magic? A trick? I did not believe in demons. And I knew Holmes believed in them even less. He believed everything could be explained, if one found the right piece of the puzzle. When night fell, Holmes returned. His clothes were stained with mud, his face weary, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. I gave him the old notebook and recounted what the man had seen, this shadowless figure. He turned each page slowly, reading with care, then sat motionless for a long time. "Watson," he finally said, "do you know, there is a way to make a man cast no shadow?" I shook my head. Holmes picked up a pen and drew a flat surface with two light sources placed on opposite sides. Then he sketched a human figure standing between them. If light is projected equally from both directions and with the same intensity, shadows cancel each other out. But that only works under artificial conditions. Such a setup is impossible under natural moonlight. I asked, "Then how do we explain what the old man saw?" Holmes looked at me, his voice lower than usual. "If not the light, then perhaps the shadow was hidden. Somehow, the man might have used a reflective material to scatter the moonlight at his feet, preventing any shadow from forming. Or, he manipulated the witness's mind, inducing a psychological effect that made him believe he saw what wasn't there." We sat in silence for a while. Then Holmes continued. "But whichever method was used, the purpose remains the same, to sow fear. When people believe a creature exists that casts no shadow, they stop searching for rational explanations. And that, Watson, is what concerns me most. Because behind such superstition, there is always a human hand at work." The next morning, Holmes asked me to accompany him to the witness, the man who had seen the shadowless figure. He reluctantly showed us the spot where he had been standing. It was an open field, free of trees or obstructions, where moonlight could clearly illuminate every blade of grass. Holmes took precise measurements, light angles, distances, terrain, and inspected the ground. After nearly an hour, he picked up a small shard of broken mirror. Its surface had a strange reflective coating, not ordinary glass, but a kind used to create special effects on stage. He gave a cold smile. "A trick. Simple, but effective." I didn't understand immediately. He placed a special mirror at his feet, perhaps several small pieces, or a large flat sheet, coated with reflective material to distort the incoming light. From a distance, the shadow would vanish. A circus trick, but here turned into a tool of murder. I asked, "Then who is he? Why go to such lengths to create this illusion?" Holmes didn't answer at once. He looked toward the distant forest, where the shadows still lay thick as spilled ink. "Because he wants to mislead. He doesn't want people to think there's a killer among them. He wants them to believe in a demon. And when everyone fears something that doesn't exist, he can go on killing, freely." I shuddered. A murderer using illusion to hide his crimes, that was more terrifying than any demon. Holmes murmured, almost to himself. "Darkness isn't frightening. What's frightening is someone who knows how to control the light." Back at the wooden house, Holmes reopened all our case notes. He now divided the case into two parts, the supernatural elements, meticulously staged to deceive the villagers, and the reality hidden behind a curtain of fear. He turned to me and asked, "Watson, if you were a murderer and wanted no one to discover you, what would you do?" I answered, "I'd give them something else to worry about. A threat big enough to make everyone look the other way." Holmes nodded. "Exactly. That means this person is intelligent, patient enough to have prepared for a long time. He understands what the villagers fear, how superstitious they are. And most importantly, he doesn't kill randomly. Each death serves a purpose." I asked, "Then what is the goal?" Holmes looked at me. "Power. Wealth. Or the concealment of a great secret." That night, Holmes again stayed up. He wrote names on the board, dates of death, locations, and began connecting them into a network. When the dawn finally broke, he said, "Watson, we're not just chasing a killer. We're walking into a web spun from invisible threads. And the worst has yet to begin." I understood then, the man without a shadow was not a demon. He was someone who knew how to use darkness to turn everything into a game he alone could control. Chapter 4, The Cursed Painting. There are memories that do not reside in the mind, but cling to the hands of the artist, as if someone from beyond this world is borrowing them to recount a buried truth. That afternoon, when the sunlight touched the edge of the forest, Holmes decided to return to the victim's house, the place where all the horrors began. The man had been burned in a strange and gruesome manner, and the traces around the body remained vivid in my memory. But Holmes did not return for the corpse, he came back for the remnants left in a room that seemed to hold nothing of value. The house stood at the end of the village, isolated, dilapidated. The scent of scorched wood lingered in the air like an unspoken warning. We stepped through the scattered debris. There wasn't much furniture, mostly books, empty bottles, and sketch paper. Holmes practically tore the room apart until he stopped in front of a heavy curtain hanging on the west wall. Behind the curtain was a large painting, hidden from view. Light filtering through the window highlighted the stiff, faded brushstrokes. Holmes pulled the painting into the center of the room, and we both stood in silence. It was an image of a towering creature, humanoid in form but with a demon's face, coarse black skin, horns sharp enough to tear the sky, and eyes, glowing red like twin embers. The beast stood in a forest, surrounded by night, behind it fallen trees and a long streak of blood. In the lower right corner of the painting was a faded inscription, "Dartmoor, the one who comes from the ancient mist." I asked Holmes, "Is this the creature the villagers speak of?" He nodded slightly, then leaned in close to the painting. Even to the naked eye, I could see something strange. The paint layers were not uniform. Beneath the black strokes were older markings, covered up by newer additions. Holmes used a thin knife to peel back part of the upper layer, revealing beneath it, the same creature, but drawn with a different hand. More brutal, more savage. "Watson, do you see it?" I nodded, a wave of unease rising within me. I whispered, "It was repainted." Holmes corrected me. "Not just once. At least 3 times. I asked, "Who repainted it? And why?" Holmes rummaged through a desk drawer and found a sketchbook. Inside were many drafts, demonic heads, red eyes, twisted faces, some furiously crossed out, others redrawn nearly identically, but each version bore a subtle change: longer arms, teeth jutting outward, a tongue dragging on the ground. The victim himself repainted this, Holmes concluded. But he did not attempt to explain it through psychology, as others might. He looked at me and asked, "Have you ever seen a person haunted by something they imagined themselves?" I replied, "Yes. In madness. In hallucinatory disorders. In a mind that no longer knows what is real." Holmes shook his head. "I believe this man didn't imagine it. He saw it. And tried to recreate it. The more he painted, the more terrified he became, the more terrified, the more he felt compelled to paint. As if it were his only defense against the horror." We looked at each other. I remembered what the villagers had said. In the last few months, the victim barely left the house, painting obsessively and muttering strange things about demons and blood. Some believed he was possessed. Others said he'd gone mad. But no one asked why, they were too afraid. Holmes walked to the window and gazed at the distant forest. He said, "This painting isn't merely imagination. It's a message. A warning. And if my suspicions are correct, the killer is using this very obsession to blur the line between reality and illusion." I looked at the painting again. Now, it was no longer just an image. It felt as if it were staring back at me. The red eyes seemed to pierce through layers of time, carrying the curse of something ancient, something no one dared name. I asked Holmes. "What do you think Dartmoor is?" Holmes replied. "A symbol. An image crafted to evoke ancient fear. But if that symbol is repeated across generations, it ceases to be fiction. It becomes part of the subconscious. A tool to control the mind." He bent over the desk and drew a map marking all the murders that had occurred in the village over the past 100 years. What I saw made me shudder. Every 10 years, at least one disappearance or killing, always in late autumn, when the fog was thickest. And there was a stranger coincidence: every victim had once lived in this very house. I was speechless. Holmes whispered. "The house isn't cursed. Someone is using it as a tool. Every generation has a new victim, and each one repaints the picture left by the one before, as if compelled to continue an unfinished tale." I asked. "Then who is behind it?" Holmes was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know yet. But I'm certain, it isn't a demon. It's a human being. One who understands how to sow fear like seeds into the mind." That night, Holmes took the painting back with him. He set it up beside the fireplace, where the flickering flames cast moving shadows across its surface, making the creature seem to stir. He sat in front of it all night, writing notes, comparing sketches, redrawing each layer to uncover the changes. I couldn't sleep. There was something in Holmes's eyes as he stared at the painting that made me uneasy. As if he, too, was beginning to be drawn into the painting's hypnotic pull. Before dawn, Holmes said, "Watson, I believe I know what we must find next. Not the weapon. The artist." I was surprised. "But the artist is the victim, he's already dead." Holmes shook his head. "No. I'm not talking about the last one. I want to know who painted it first. Who created the image of the Dartmoor demon? Because if we can find him, we'll know what's truly being hidden behind the shadow that calls itself evil." Chapter 5. The Confession of a Madman. Not everyone fears the demon they see. But those who are blind and still hear its whispers, that is the deepest nightmare born of darkness. The next morning, Holmes left the village at dawn, carrying a small dossier he had copied from the records found in the victim's home. Inside were scattered scraps of notes, written in erratic, twisted handwriting, but amid the chaotic lines, Holmes had discovered a name that repeated several times: Silas. Silas, the victim's younger brother, had once lived in the same house for a short time before vanishing without a trace. No one spoke of him, no one in the village mentioned his name. Holmes had found an old, yellowed clipping in a local newspaper. Silas had been committed to a mental hospital on the outskirts of Plymouth after suffering a violent episode of hysteria. I accompanied Holmes to the hospital. The building was a cold stone structure, isolated among grey hills, its windows barred with iron grills. A strange haze hung over the grounds, not mist, but a suffocating sense of abandonment. We were led down a long corridor filled with the rustling of footsteps, the groans and murmurs from locked rooms. The attending doctor pointed to the last room at the end of the hallway. "He hasn't said much in years. Only when the fits come does he repeat a few phrases. Most of us think it's just hallucinations." Holmes said nothing and pushed open the door. Silas sat hunched in a wooden chair, his head tilted sharply to one side, eyes vacant. His eyes were completely clouded, pure white, devoid of pupils. As we approached, Holmes asked gently, "Silas, do you remember the house in Dartmoor?" Silas didn't react. Holmes changed his approach. He leaned in and whispered, "It's still there. In the woods. And the painting didn't fully burn." Silas's body trembled. His head slowly lifted, and his lips moved. A hoarse, rasping sound rose from his throat. "It lives, in the dark." Holmes signaled for silence. I stood frozen, staring at him, this pale, hollow figure who seemed never to have seen sunlight. Silas repeated, his voice a whisper like wind slipping through a crack in the wall. It whispers in my ear, all night. It wants blood, blood from those who remember. Holmes leaned in closer. Who was the first to paint it? Silas didn't answer right away. He raised his hand to his head and struck his temple hard. I didn't see it, but it's inside me. I didn't see it, but I heard it laugh. Holmes frowned. He murmured. You didn't see it. Because you are blind. And then Holmes turned to look at me, his eyes flashing with that familiar sharp gleam that appeared whenever he identified a crucial clue. Watson, do you understand what this means? Before I could respond, Silas screamed, as if someone were choking him from behind. It's in the walls. It moves through shadows. It doesn't need light, because it's not human. The nurses rushed in and restrained Silas. He screamed until his voice cracked, then collapsed, still mumbling 3 words, in the dark. On the way out, I was still reeling. I asked Holmes. What does a blind man see in the dark? How could he create such horrors, or hear whispers, if it's not just the result of a fractured mind? Holmes's voice grew low. That's the key. Silas has been blind since childhood. He has never seen light, much less formed visual imagery. So the things he describes, the red eyes, the laughter, the thirst for blood, could not have come from his own imagination. I fell silent. Holmes continued. So where did he learn it? Who planted those images in his mind? And why is it that the same description of this monstrous creature appears across generations, even in those who have never seen a single image? I murmured. Perhaps he's just repeating what others have said. Holmes shook his head. No. He lived in isolation with his brother for many years. There was no one else. And the hospital records show that from the very first night he was admitted, he began speaking of the creature in the dark, in vivid, specific detail. Not mere repetition, but a fear that had rotted him from within. I suddenly understood. You suspect, someone has been planting those images into the minds of each victim? Holmes nodded. Not just planting. Cultivating them. Like growing a poisonous fungus in the mind. Over time, it thrives without light. And those who are mentally vulnerable, like Silas, are the ideal hosts. On the road back to the village, Holmes opened his notebook and wrote a single line. If the one who sows darkness is human, then he must have once lived in the light. I looked at him. Is it possible that he is the one who first painted the image? Holmes didn't answer. But his eyes were fixed on the distant forest, where the sunset had already been swallowed by the night, as if it had never existed. Chapter 6, The Locked Room. Not every door needs a key to open. Some mysteries only reveal themselves when we learn to see through silence. A relentless rain fell for 3 days straight after we left the asylum. On the way back, Holmes remained silent the entire journey, his gaze lost in thoughts so deep that even the rumble of thunder could not draw him back. I dared not interrupt his train of thought, for I knew, when Holmes falls into silence, his mind is racing at its fastest. On the afternoon of the 4th day, a sudden, urgent knocking shattered the heavy stillness. The man who arrived was the chief constable of Dartmoor, his face pale, his cloak soaked through. Another murder, he said. This time, inside a locked room. Holmes rose instantly. Without asking a single question, he grabbed his coat, donned his hat, and strode out. I followed close behind. The scene was a small house at the edge of the village, isolated and damp. The victim was Ellis Carrington, a scholar who studied folk beliefs. The locals called him an eccentric. He kept to himself, never ventured out after dark, and most notably, he only lit candles, never oil lamps. The police told us he had been found dead in his study. The door had been locked from the inside. No windows open, no tunnels, no signs of forced entry. We entered the room. A chill ran down my spine as I crossed the threshold. On the floor lay Carrington's body, face up, eyes wide open in a frozen stare, still marked with utter terror. A deep gash ran across his throat, cut clean through the windpipe, blood soaking the wooden floorboards. On the desk was nothing but a half-burned candle and several crumpled pages, written in a strange, dark red ink. "What about the door?" I asked. The officer brought me over. The brass lock was intact, unmarked. The key was still in the lock, on the inside. Holmes said nothing. He crouched down, examining every corner, every small gap between the floorboards. Suddenly, he stopped and frowned. With gloved hands, he used tweezers to retrieve a small object from beneath the desk. A scrap of skin. Small, rough, and covered in coarse, dark gray fur. "Animal hide," I said. Holmes shook his head. "No. This is too soft, too thin to be from a wolf or forest fox. And this fur, it doesn't match any wild species native to this region." He slipped the piece into his pocket. Then he scanned the room once more, standing completely still for nearly 10 minutes. Finally, he turned to me. "Watson, this locked room wasn't meant to keep something out. It was meant to keep something in." A chill crept through me. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. Holmes didn't answer. He walked the room again, then stopped at the bookshelf. Silently, he pulled out an old, worn leather-bound notebook with no title. He flipped through several pages quickly, his eyes lighting up as he found a section marked in bold red ink. "The Dartmoor demon, a nocturnal being without a fixed form. It can slip through cracks in the door, live in the breath of darkness. Those who see it are no longer human. Those who do not see it, are no longer human either." Holmes closed the notebook and looked at me. Carrington knew what it was. He may have been the only one in the village willing to study it to the end. And because of that, he was killed. I shook my head. "But this room has no exit. How could the killer have escaped?" Holmes tapped on the left-hand wall. The sound echoed hollow. "This wall isn't solid. There may be a space inside." I watched him, waiting. But Holmes only said, "We can't break it open yet. If there's something hidden in there, the killer will come back to check." Then he crouched by the corpse, gently lifting the collar. And this time, I saw it. A bruise. Circular, like the imprint of a claw. Holmes stood, his eyes cold as steel. "Watson, this isn't just a murder. It's a ritual." I was stunned. "You mean someone is reenacting the legend, or using it to cover a series of crimes?" Holmes replied. "Perhaps both." Before we left, Holmes returned the notebook to its place on the shelf. He glanced toward the corner of the room, where the candlelight flickered against the aged wall. Then he said softly, almost to himself, "Some creatures do not exist. But the fear of them is deadly enough." Chapter 7, The Knocking at 3 a.m. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing isn't the sound in the night, but the silence that follows. That night, the village of Dartmoor was cloaked in an unnatural stillness. No barking dogs, no howling wind, not even the call of an owl as usual. Only a thick fog covered the rooftops, like a mournful shroud cast over the entire village. We were staying at a small inn, about a mile from the crime scene. Holmes had specifically requested a room on the second floor, with a window facing west, toward the forest the villagers called the Devil's Wood. I slept in the room next door, but found it impossible to rest after what we had witnessed in Carrington's locked room. Around 3 in the morning, I suddenly opened my eyes, chilled to the bone. I couldn't tell whether it was the cold, or a deep unease. I had just begun to turn over when the knocking came. 3 knocks. Clear. evenly spaced, like a heartbeat. Holmes had heard it too. I knew because his door swung open immediately after. He stood there in a white shirt, holding an oil lamp, his eyes shining in the dark. Another 3 knocks. This time louder, coming from his window. I rushed over, heart pounding. Holmes said nothing, only raised his hand, signaling me to stay silent. Together, we crept toward the window. The thin silk curtain swayed slightly, though there was no wind outside. Holmes pushed the window open. No one was there. But when the light from his lamp fell on the wooden frame, I nearly cried out. 3 claw marks, deep as knife wounds, long and curved like the talons of a predator. The wood had been torn, the paint stripped away, and a faint, metallic stench lingered in the air. Holmes leaned in close. His eyes narrowed as his fingers gently traced the grooves. No mud, no footprints, no powdery residue. Whatever left these marks didn't stand on the ledge. It didn't cling to the wall. The claws were imprinted cleanly, but without support. As if it had appeared and vanished into thin air. I shivered. In that moment, I truly felt that something not of this world had stood behind the glass. Holmes turned to me. His eyes no longer cold and sharp, but heavy with thought. "Watson, are you starting to believe?" I didn't answer. Because I no longer knew what to believe. We stayed awake the rest of the night. Holmes brought out the scrap of skin found at Carrington's crime scene and placed it next to the claw marks on the wood. The size matched perfectly. Both in length and curvature. But the strangest thing was, the fur on the scrap began to stand up, as if reacting to something unseen. Holmes whispered something I never thought I'd hear from him. It may not be entirely a creature. Nor entirely a man. Perhaps it is the result of a convergence, of fear, legend, and forgotten truth. I didn't understand. He continued. We may be dealing with a killer, yes. But he hides behind a symbol, a figure the villagers have whispered about for generations. A figure not detectable by the naked eye. I looked out the window again, where the fog had yet to lift. The forest in the distance loomed like a dark abyss. Holmes went on. 3 knocks. 3 claw marks. 3 deaths. Do you see the pattern? I froze. 3 victims. The man in the abandoned crypt, the scholar Carrington in the locked room, and the blood-stained whispers of the madman in the asylum. Holmes continued. If the killer is using ancient beliefs to manipulate fear, then the rituals he performs are not random. They're messages. Possibly warnings. Possibly summons. I stepped back, staring once more at the claw marks on the window frame. They were more than evidence of presence. They were a declaration. Holmes silently drew the curtain shut, lit another lamp, and pulled out a map of Dartmoor. He marked 3 locations, the ancient tomb, Carrington's home, and our inn. The points formed a triangle. Holmes nodded. What's at the center of this triangle, Watson? I studied the map carefully. In the center, was a deep stretch of forest, unnamed, with only a faint handwritten note, restricted area, no access. Holmes spoke, his voice deliberate. Tomorrow, we go in. Before nightfall. I opened my mouth to protest, then closed it. Because I knew, if we didn't walk into the darkness, we would never discover what was knocking in the night. Chapter 8, The Woman in Black. There are spirits that do not vanish with the ashes, they merely wait for the right night to return. The next morning, the air in Dartmoor felt thick and heavy. Gray clouds blanketed the sky, and weak light filtered through the leaves. When Holmes and I stepped out of the inn, something had changed. Not in the wind, not in the earth, but in the villagers' eyes. They whispered. They looked in one direction. And every time her name was mentioned, silence immediately fell, as if they feared their very breath might awaken a ghost. A strange woman had appeared in the village at dawn. She wore a black cloak that completely covered her body, and a wide-brimmed hat that concealed her entire face. No one had seen her eyes, nose, mouth, or any identifiable feature. She spoke to no one, made no contact, entered no homes. She only walked the village crossroads, always choosing the paths most shrouded in shadow, always avoiding the sunlight. An old mushroom seller whispered that the woman had once lived in the Ashen House, a home that had burned down in a great fire 20 years ago. Rumor had it that a demon-summoning ritual had taken place there. The family who lived inside vanished without a trace, leaving only gray ash and blood-stained symbols burned into the stone walls. Holmes said nothing. But I knew he had made up his mind. We would follow the woman in black. That afternoon, when she appeared again in the small village square, Holmes slipped into the shadows behind an abandoned market stall, eyes fixed on her every move. She never turned her head, but slowed her pace as she passed the window of the old apothecary. Her gloved finger lightly touched the glass, leaving behind a faint mark, like a trace of ash. Then she turned down the stone path leading to the forest's edge, toward the place where the Ashen House had once stood. We followed in silence, step by step, careful not to make a sound. She never looked back. But strangely, the closer we came, the slower she walked, as if she were leading us, not escaping. When the shadows stretched down to our ankles, she stopped. Before us lay a dark stone foundation, littered with crumbling bricks and rotting debris. No walls remained, only a few charred wooden posts and a cracked, ancient well in the center of the cold, barren ground. This was the site of the Ashen House. The woman stood at the center of the ruins, her back still to us. Holmes signaled for me to stop. He pulled out a small spyglass and observed her carefully. She knelt down, placing something on the stone floor, a round object wrapped in black cloth, looking like an offering. Holmes stared intently, then suddenly furrowed his brow. At that moment, a piercing wind sliced through the trees. Her wide-brimmed hat flew up into the air. There was no face. Not hidden, absent. Completely empty, like a shadow shaped from smoke. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, only a dark void beneath the hood. I instinctively stepped back, my foot snapping a dry twig beneath me. The woman turned. But in that exact moment, a dense black mist swirled upward like smoke, engulfing the entire area. When the wind cleared, the stone foundation was empty. No woman. No offering. Only silent ruins, and a scorched smell of burned wood rising from deep underground. Holmes strode swiftly to where she had stood, searching every corner. On the stone floor, there remained a faint imprint in gray ash, a circle with 3 arrows pointing inward, identical to the symbol drawn on the final page of Carrington's notebook. Holmes picked up a singed strand of fur nearby. His eyes narrowed. "Watson, do you remember the claw marks on the window frame?" I nodded. Holmes whispered. "The fur and claws belong to no known animal. They have an origin, but they've been altered. Possibly burned. Possibly, summoned." We left the Ashen House as night fell, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly left. Something had come with us, clinging to each footstep, waiting for the right moment to appear again, when the moon rose high, and the knocking returned. Chapter 9, The Secret of the Twin Graves. There are truths not buried by time, but awakened by it. After the strange encounter at the Ashen House, Holmes grew more silent than ever. His stack of notes began to pile up, each line tangled with traces, every detail connecting to a slowly emerging image, a dark force that existed not only in the minds of the superstitious, but perhaps in the world itself. That morning, as a steady drizzle fell over the land of Dartmoor, Holmes led me to an old cemetery nearly 3 miles northeast of the village. It was a forgotten place, untended, with wild weeds covering the paths and gravestones leaning like weary spirits. The air was thick with the scent of damp moss, so cold it felt like each breath turned to mist. Holmes stopped in front of a cracked gravestone. The inscription was nearly illegible. He brushed aside the lichen covering it, then gently pointed out two graves lying side by side, marked only with dates of birth and death, the year 1803. According to old records Holmes had found in an abandoned monastery, these were the graves of Elric and Morwenna, a couple once accused by the villagers of witchcraft. They had been burned alive in a public execution in the square, where the crowd screamed for blood and lit their torches with trembling hands full of fear. I bent down to examine the two graves. One of the headstones showed signs of recent disturbance. The soil above it had slightly sunk, and the grass had yellowed along the uneven outline of the wooden coffin below. Holmes pulled out a small crowbar he had brought along, and began to carefully dig into the earth. I silently assisted him, my heart pounding in my chest like a war drum of foreboding. We managed to open the first coffin lid. Empty. No body, no burial shroud, no bones. Only deep, violent scratch marks etched into the wood of the coffin lid from the inside. The gouges were long, sharp, and deeply carved, not the marks of someone resting in peace, but of someone who had awakened in terror and tried to claw their way out in desperation. Holmes was pensive. He lightly touched the marks, his eyes cold and distant. Elric had been the one buried in this coffin. According to surviving documents, he was a quiet man, often seen near the forest's edge, with a strange knowledge of ancient symbolic scripts. Morwenna, his wife, was rumored to have performed summoning rituals. But it was Elric who vanished first. Morwenna was burned at the stake several days later. I asked Holmes, "Who do you think opened this grave?" Holmes shook his head. "No one opened it from the outside. The grass is undisturbed, and the topsoil hasn't been tampered with. The claw marks inside show that some living being awoke and escaped the coffin on its own." A chill ran down my spine. Could it be someone had been buried alive? Holmes didn't answer. He simply took from his pocket the piece of skin recovered from the locked room case. He compared the texture of the epidermis with the wood inside the coffin lid, then spoke in a low voice. "The structure of the skin fragment does not match that of a human. But it shows a strange similarity to histology samples taken from creatures that survive in darkness and toxic environments. As if a human body had been altered." I asked softly, "What are you suggesting?" Holmes replied curtly, "I don't think we're investigating a murder anymore. I think we're tracing the aftermath of a transformation ritual, one in which a dead person was reborn as something else." At that moment, a chilling hiss echoed from behind the cemetery. A gust of wind rose, swirling dust and dead leaves around us. A raven soared overhead, letting out a cry that sounded like a strangled sob. Holmes stood, his eyes fixed on the distant forest. "Something has escaped. And it's trying to return, not to life, but to the dark." Chapter 10, The Shadow in the Mirror. It is easy to be deceived by things without clear shape, but few things are more terrifying than a shadow that knows how to hide within the truth. After returning from the cemetery of the twin graves, both Holmes and I could feel a growing interweaving of gloom and mystery clinging to every detail of the case. But nothing sent a chill down my spine like Holmes summoning me once more to the crime scene, where the victim had been murdered inside the locked room. I brought along my medical kit, a camera, and an old magnifying glass that Holmes had specifically requested. He believed something subtle, something beyond the ordinary, was hidden in the smallest details, something that the naked eye could not easily detect. We entered the old house, where the walls had yellowed and carried the musty scent of time. The locked room was a bedroom on the second floor, where the body had been found under mysterious circumstances. Holmes handed me a photograph of the scene taken by the local inspector. The image was blurry, lit faintly by an oil lamp, but what drew Holmes's attention was a strange shadow in the right-hand corner of the picture, near the window. I didn't see it clearly at first, but when I held the magnifying glass up and examined the contours of the shadow, a chill spread across my spine. It was not the shadow of an ordinary person. It was distorted, twisting as if stretched by an invisible force, its curves inexplicable, and the head disproportionately large compared to the body. Its form reminded me of creatures one finds only in old fairy tales and terrifying legends. Holmes slowly took out a small hand mirror and positioned it in front of the lamp on the table. He angled the mirror carefully, reflecting the light onto the photograph, and examined it closely. His eyes lit up. He said, "No one in this village has a shape like that." We recalled the old rumors about the Dartmoor demon. A creature with blazing red eyes and a towering frame. But the shadow in the photograph was more than a traditional monster. It bore the imprint of something that may once have been human, now horrifically transformed. Holmes insisted it was no illusion, it was photographic evidence of a real entity. A being capable of transformation, shape-shifting, or warped in some unnatural way. I wondered whether that shadow might be the very thing that left the enormous footprints deep in the forest. Or perhaps it was the force behind the string of mysterious murders. Holmes carefully wrapped the photo, but his gaze remained fixed on it. He said, "This tells us something important. We can't judge everything with our ordinary senses. Our enemy may exist in states science cannot yet explain. And we must find a way to see what no one else can, if we're to stop it." Before leaving the room, Holmes turned to me and said, "Watson, I want you to keep this photograph safe. It is the most important clue we have so far. The shadow in it is not just a sign, it is a warning." I nodded, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on my shoulders. This was no longer an ordinary investigation. It was leading us into a labyrinth of darkness, where the line between life and death, between man and monster, had grown disturbingly thin. And I knew, the next step would be the turning point, where we would have to confront, face to face, whatever it was that now lurked in the shadows. Chapter 11, The Death of the Demon Hunter. Some face the darkness not out of fear, but because they believe they can conquer it. Yet sometimes, it is that very courage that leads to an unexplained death. News of the demon hunter's death spread quickly through the small village, where stories of mystical creatures constantly lurked in every shadowed corner. The man had once claimed he would use a silver bullet to end the demon that terrorized the villagers. But now, his body was found stiff and lifeless deep in the forest, his hand still gripping the silver bullet, unfired, still in its leather sheath. When Holmes and I arrived at the scene, the forest was bathed in twilight shadows, and mist began to weave through the canopy. The damp air mixed with the scent of earth and wood, creating a heavy, somber atmosphere. The hunter's body lay face down on a bed of decaying leaves, stiff as if resisting a final battle. His right hand clenched the gleaming silver bullet tightly, while his left arm held a length of leather cord, which seemed to have been used to bind something. Holmes bent down and examined the scene carefully, his keen eyes scanning every small detail. He said nothing for several minutes, seemingly trying to reconstruct the sequence of events from the marks on the body and the surrounding terrain. Suddenly, he pointed to the ground nearby, where shiny chemical stains glistened under the beam of a small flashlight. A strange chemical had been scattered around the body. Not something ordinary a demon hunter would use for self-defense. Holmes collected some samples into a small vial, preparing to take them back to the lab for analysis. I asked him, "This doesn't sound like a normal encounter between man and demon." Holmes nodded. "Exactly. The fact that the hunter never fired the silver bullet, despite being fully equipped, means one thing: his enemy not only had superior strength but also a cunning that completely disoriented the target." He continued, "This chemical isn't meant to kill but seems designed to control or contain something. Most likely, it's what prevented the demon from escaping or weakened it for a certain period." I looked around the dense forest setting, with thick foliage and towering ancient trees. This place seemed like a natural trap, long prepared for a fierce battle. Holmes added, "This hunter wasn't an ordinary man. He must have studied this creature carefully, knew its weaknesses but lacked the strength or allies to deal with it. From villagers' testimonies, we learned that the hunter had ventured into the forest many times, carrying mysterious tools, precious metals like silver, and vials of unknown liquids. His goal was to find a way to destroy the demon, or more precisely, to confront something that had lived in the darkness for so long that people only dared to speak of it as legend. Holmes stood up, his gaze sharp as a blade. We must find the source of this chemical, and more importantly, understand why the hunter was killed while still holding the silver bullet in his hand. That night, we decided to return home, carrying the samples and our theories for further analysis. Inside me grew a deep unease. It seemed the enemy Holmes pursued was not merely a mystical creature but an entity woven from both scientific mystery and supernatural enigma. The wind howled through the window, reminding us that the darkness remained, watching, waiting. And the chase of the demon in the shadows was far from over. Chapter 12, The Night of the Blood Moon. There are nights when not only darkness envelopes everything, but even the moon is stained red, like a warning sign of the dark events about to unfold. The blood moon night came as a final warning, plunging the small village into utter panic. Every house was locked tight, windows shuttered, and the villagers rushed to hide in chaos. Whispers of demons filled the air, as if everyone believed something dreadful was about to happen that very night. Holmes and I were not in the village. We had chosen to hide near the edge of the ancient forest, where the giant footprints had appeared in previous cases, the place known as the Devil's Forest. Our purpose was to wait, watch, and miss nothing. The clear sky gradually turned to a fiery red hue cast by the moon, a rare phenomenon but not unheard of in folk legends. The red moon, or blood moon, was traditionally seen as an omen of the coming of supernatural forces. As the red moonlight began to illuminate the deep forest, the atmosphere thickened, as if compressed by the presence of something colossal. From the darkness emerged a creature, its size far surpassing any ordinary animal. That giant shadow moved slowly but with overwhelming power, each step echoing like thunder in the night. Holmes did not take his eyes off the creature. Clearly, this was the demon the villagers shuddered to speak of. But one thing made him pause in thought: the creature wore a mask. The mask was not a natural part of its body, but clearly a human-made object placed over its face. Its presence completely changed the picture we had of this mysterious killer. Holmes whispered. That giant creature might not be a natural monster. It could be a human. Or an entity controlled by humans, intentionally wearing the mask to instill supernatural fear in the villagers. I looked more closely at the mask the creature wore. It was made of metal, coated with a matte material, with small openings for the eyes and mouth. The mask's design was far from random, it carried a very strange pattern, reminiscent of ancient rituals associated with demons. We could not identify exactly who or what the creature was. But the presence of the mask showed there was a human hand behind everything, deliberately hiding its identity and amplifying the terror. While I observed, Holmes quietly took notes on every detail, from the way the creature moved to the sounds of its heavy footsteps and rapid breathing. Suddenly, the creature stopped, turning its gaze toward a small area in the forest where strange chemical stains had been found around the demon hunter's body. It seemed to be guarding a specific spot, or waiting for someone. Holmes said solemnly. We have found the most important clue yet. The fact that this creature wears a mask is a detail we cannot overlook. It may be the key to unlocking the secret of the origin and true purpose of the terror it spreads. We continued to watch until the creature slowly vanished into the deep darkness of the forest, leaving behind only the rustling of leaves and a suffocating heaviness in the air. The night of the blood moon ended, but the question still hung heavily in our minds: who was behind the mask? What did they want? And did we have the strength to face the truth hidden beneath this veil of darkness? The answers lay ahead, deep in the dense darkness of the gloomy forest, where every step could bring us closer to, or further from, the truth. Chapter 13, The Truth Beneath the Devil's Skin. There is one thing always true in every mystery: not everything that appears before your eyes is the truth, and behind the mask often hides a human being with a cunning scheme. Holmes stood in the silent room of the abandoned house on the edge of the forest, following the final traces of the culprit. After months of chasing shadows and exaggerated folk legends, the truth finally emerged like light piercing through a thick fog. The one behind all the crimes was not a supernatural creature as the villagers imagined, but a human. But not just an ordinary human. He was a sophisticated villain who knew how to wear the devil's guise to spread fear and conceal his true nature. His eyes were cold beneath the metal mask, his skin hidden under layers of chemicals and hallucinogens to transform into a terrifying entity no one dared to suspect. Holmes opened a small box containing the complex tools he had collected during the investigation. Bottles of medicine, chemical powders, psychological control devices, and old documents about the legends were carefully arranged. Through the yellowed pages, Holmes discovered that the culprit had thoroughly studied human psychology, exploiting superstition and invisible fears to manipulate the villagers. However, what caught Holmes's particular attention was not just the culprit himself. He did not act alone. In the shadows, there was a network of others, those who silently controlled and supported him in this horrifying plan. Holmes mentally pieced together every clue, from the whispers of the victim's younger brother, the strange chemical traces around the demon hunter's body, to the appearance of the mysterious woman in black and the house reduced to ashes, all seemed linked into a deliberate scheme. The culprit used the mask not only to conceal his identity but also as a symbol of power, building the image of the Dartmoor demon in the villagers' eyes. The hallucinogens made people believe in the supernatural, while sophisticated psychological tactics made their fear spiral uncontrollably. Holmes sighed as he looked at the cold face in the final crime scene photo. The man could be considered a demon, but in reality, it was humans who created demons to hide their true faces. The investigation revealed that the true power of the demon did not lie in its shape or the howls in the night, but in a deep understanding of human psychology, manipulation and deception. But the most terrifying thing was the network behind the man wearing the devil's mask, those invisible shadows not yet exposed. Holmes knew this battle was far from over, and he had to move forward to uncover the whole truth before it was too late. Chapter 14, The Master of Darkness. There is an undeniable truth: darkness exists only when the light is not strong enough to shine through, and reason is the only force that can push back the gloom of superstition and fear. Holmes stood before the old house hidden behind dense foliage, where for weeks he had been tracking the footsteps of the woman in black. The true mastermind behind the series of horrifying crimes terrorizing the village of Dartmoor. She was neither a supernatural being nor a demon as rumors suggested, but a skilled hypnotist, an expert in chemistry and psychology, tools that forged terror through intellect and ruthlessness. The villagers had once called her a witch, driving her into the ashes of the past, burning all hope and memories. Now, she had returned, not only for revenge but to turn fear into a weapon, hiding the truth behind the mask of the demon. Holmes looked deeply into her eyes, reflecting determination and resolve, not of a monster, but of a human consumed by deep hatred. She had used hypnotic techniques to manipulate the villagers, making them believe in absurd things, while medicines and chemicals helped create terrifying hallucinations. The chase through the darkness finally reached its climax. Holmes needed no supernatural power, no mystical tools. Only the light of reason and truth to strip away the demon's mask and expose the true face of the mysterious woman. The flashlight beam pierced the darkness, illuminating the hidden corners where the darkest truths lay. In desperation, she tried to resist with her last hypnotic words, but Holmes was prepared. Watson stood beside him, supporting with devices they had gathered during the investigation, blocking every escape route. As night gave way to dawn, the woman in black was captured, leaving behind a long story of cruelty, hatred, and superstition that had clouded human reason. Holmes breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that light and reason had triumphed over darkness and superstition, restoring peace to Dartmoor and ending an unprecedented reign of terror.